Now let's move on and talk about logic. Logic and the existence of God. Again, repeating the idea that we're looking at abstract concepts like math and logic and seeing how a naturalist or an evolutionary or an atheistic worldview could explain those. Let's look at logic and the existence of God. What is logic? Dr. Jason Lisle, another creation scientist, he says this: the laws of logic tell us what conclusions we may legitimately draw from any given premises or any given claims. In a sense, the laws of logic describe the correct chain of reasoning from premises to conclusion. So from other words, from making claims about truth and stating claims to drawing the right conclusion. There is a correct chain of reasoning. And this is sort of how he is defining it. Let me give you an example of a logical argument. Now, when we're talking about logical arguments, we're not talking about fighting. We're talking about making a case via propositions and conclusions to try and prove something or demonstrate some truth. Here's the premise, the first premise, or proposition or truth claim. The Bible says homosexuality is a sin. That's premise 1. Premise 2, the Bible is true. Therefore, the conclusion, or the third proposition or claim that come out of the first two, is it is true that homosexuality is a sin. This is a logical argument. If premise 1 is true, if premise 2 is true, then premise 3 must be true. That's the argument. You see how that works? The law of non-contradiction is a logical argument. It's a logical principle. And it says this: something cannot be true and not true at the same time and in the same situation. Let me give you an example. This is an example of a logical principle, logical truth. So this statement cannot be true. Wes is teaching this session. Wes Moore is sitting here teaching this session, and Wes Moore is not teaching this session. You see, those are contradictions. They both cannot be true. This is an example of how logic will help us. So let me use this now to tie into something very practical. Let's look at this. Let's say you've lost your keys. Let's look at how important logic is to actually finding your keys. All right, so I can't find my keys. I walk in, I can't find my keys. Someone says, look in the drawer. Look in that drawer. And I say, I checked that drawer. My keys are definitely not in that drawer. I open that drawer up. I look in there. It's empty. There is nothing in there. There's no way I can be wrong. There is literally no set of keys in that drawer. All right. So here's the law of non-contradiction, and here's how logic applies to real life, physical life. Your keys cannot be both not in that drawer and in that drawer at the same time. Do you see that? So once I go to that drawer and I say there is nothing in there, except one of my kids is goofing off with me and hides it in there after the fact, those keys will not be in that drawer. They have to be somewhere else. So if the law of non-contradiction was not true, I could never find my keys. You see that? Because I would go to that drawer and I would open it and I would see there's nothing in there. And I know because of the law of non-contradiction, even though I couldn't maybe say those words, I know that because they're not in there, they cannot be not in there and in there at the same time. So I move on and keep looking for my keys. And everywhere I go, I actually use the law of non-contradiction. I use logic and I check my pockets, not in there. So the law of non-contradiction says they're not in there. I go to my car, they're not in there. I go to the table under the vanity, not there. You see what I mean? The law of non-contradiction, logic helps me find my keys. So in a very real way, it applies to physical life. I found an article on UK essays entitled The Importance of Logic in Language. And they gave several examples of the importance of logic in everyday living. So let me walk you through this. Problem solving. Logic allows us to analyze concepts, arguments, and problems. So we have a problem at work, we have a problem at home. We're using reasoning to figure out how to solve the problem. What do we need to do to make this right? Without logic, we couldn't solve a problem. See, that's very important, isn't it? Communication. We use logic to present ideas in a way that's understandable. We think through, and teachers and preachers do this constantly, and it's really one of the hardest parts of teaching, is to figure out a way to organize material, to persuade, to build and defend your own views. So to make an argument, to make a case for something. If you think you deserve a raise, what are you going to say? I come here on time, I work very hard, I accomplish this project under budget. You see, you're making a case, you're making a logical argument. Those are premises leading to a conclusion. Therefore, I deserve to get paid more. And then finally, decision making. To learn, analyze, and make decisions. You couldn't make a decision in your family budget. You couldn't make a decision about where to go for dinner. So it really does apply. Logic was an abstract, but without logic, I can't physically find my keys. I can't solve my problems. I can't communicate well. I can't persuade. You see, this abstract has a lot to do with the success of human life. So we fundamentally need logic to live. Where did it come from if evolution is true? Where does this abstract come from if everything in the beginning was only physical and material? The source of logic is actually God, the Creator who is overarching the creation. Jason Lisle, we mentioned him a moment ago, the creation scientist. He wrote in an article called "Did God Create Logic?" He wrote this: "The laws of logic are a reflection of the way God thinks, and thus the way He expects us to think. The law of non-contradiction," and this is why I mentioned it and tied this quote in. See, I'm reasoning through. You see that? The law of non-contradiction is not simply one person's opinion of how we ought to think. It's just not my opinion or your opinion that we ought to use the law of non-contradiction. Rather, it stems from God's self-consistent nature. God cannot deny Himself. 2 Timothy 2:13. And all truth is in God. Therefore, truth will not contradict itself. Do you see that? So beyond this universe, behind it, the source of it, the thing that holds it up and keeps it in place, has a mind. And that mind is impressed upon the very nature of the reality that exists in that created world. And because that being is true, that being is consistent, and that being never changes, then there cannot be contradictions in the world. He goes on, laws of logic cannot exist in a materialistic, atheistic universe. Now, materialism just means a physical world, physical only. Because laws of logic are not material, they're not physical. The laws of logic are a universal standard for reasoning. Every person in the world who thinks through things properly is going to use reasoning. It doesn't matter what age they are, what culture they're from, what language they speak. It doesn't matter if they were Greeks in the Roman Empire or Chinese today or Americans 100 years ago. It universally applies, this way of reasoning. But how can an atheist have a universal standard for anything? Atheists do believe in laws of logic, but they cannot justify the existence of universal, abstract, unchanging laws within their worldview. Do you see? If we start off and everything is physical, then there can be no abstracts. But we see that there's a very real abstract called reasoning and logic. How do we explain that? Well, the atheist has a very difficult time explaining that. But the Christian, the Bible-believing Christian, does not. The Christian believes in universal, immaterial, unchanging entities because God is Himself omnipresent, meaning He's everywhere, immaterial, you can't touch, feel, or measure Him with a physical device, and unchanging. Moreover, God has thoughts, and these thoughts are reflected in the way He upholds the universe.